Hello, and welcome to this seminar on anti-Semitism on social media since the 7th of October, hosted by the UK LFI Charitable Trust. I'm Jacob Turner, a UK LFI member. The UK LFI Charitable Trust is a charity set up to advance legal education on Israel and anti-Semitism and to provide support to victims of anti-Semitism, especially that which manifests itself with regards to Israel. The UK LFI Charitable Trust website is at uklficharity.com, where there are numerous resources available on Israel and anti-Semitism, and you can also donate to support the charity's work. I am very pleased to introduce our speaker for this seminar, Dr. Matthew Bolton, who is incredibly well qualified to elaborate on these issues through both quantitative and qualitative analysis. Matthew is the co-lead of the UK team of the Decoding Anti-Semitism project, based at the Centre for Anti-Semitism Research, which is part of the Technical University Berlin. He has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Roehampton and has written widely on anti-Semitism in the UK, including Corbynism, a critical approach, published in 2018. His work has appeared in journals including Philosophy and Social Criticism, British Politics, Political Quarterly, and the Journal of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. This is an extremely topical discussion to be having for obvious reasons, given the significant increase in public criticism of Israel and Jewish people more generally in recent months, coupled with numerous anti-Semitic acts across the world. However, it is also an issue with a long history. Online anti-Israel speech, anti-Semitic speech dates back to the foundations of the internet, and more generally, the idea of anti-Semitic tropes and conspiracy theories have been prevalent in society for millennia. It's also a controversial issue, with some of those accused of anti-Semitism claiming that they are protected by free speech principles. I hope perhaps we will explore the intersection of what is new and what is old, and what is permissible and what is not, and finally, whether there are any solutions. Matthew will present for around 25 minutes, following which there will be time for questions. Please do submit questions at any time into the Q&A box at the bottom of the page, and I will put these anonymously to Matthew. Matthew, thank you very much for joining us, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk about some of the work that the Decoding Antisemitism project does and has been doing for the last 3 or 4 years now. I am going to try and share my screen, and hopefully this will work. Okay, so my talk today, I'm going to kind of start off by talking about the scale of the challenge in terms of tackling online anti-Semitism, and in fact about the scale of the challenge in terms of recognizing online anti-Semitism. I'll then talk about the way that the Decoding Anti-Semitism project seeks to meet that challenge and the kind of innovative methodological approach that we've taken to try and recognize and tackle anti-Semitism online. And then I'm going to share with you some results of our recent research into online responses to the October 7th attacks and the subsequent war between Israel and Hamas. Okay, so anti-Semitism is just in general quite a challenging thing to study, both mainly in terms of its content, because anti-Semitism has been around for a very long time and it has shifted and changed and developed over that time, both in terms of the introduction of new concepts or new stereotypes or new conspiracy theories, but also the much older almost ancient concepts and ideas get adapted and changed to new circumstances. So it's constantly shifting as a form of ideology, which means it takes a lot of constant work to keep track of the latest developments in what's going on in anti-Semitism, both offline and online. But there are additional issues in terms of looking at it online, because the way that we communicate online is not really exactly the same as the way that we communicate offline. And so the language on the internet is also constantly changing and constantly developing. There are new words, new phrases, new in-jokes, new memes, new ways in which text and image are kind of combined in quite complex ways that you really have to analyze at quite a deep level to actually understand what's going on. So it's no good just having a fixed set of categories and then trying to use those to recognize what's going on in terms of online speech, because there's a constant development. So there's development both at the level of content in terms of anti-Semitism itself and in the way that it's expressed online. And then there's also the complication of how the internet itself works and how internet communication works, in that it allows for much greater anonymity than in real life. There's a distance between the speaker and the listener when we communicate online, which causes additional complications in terms of what's understood and how things are expressed. So all of these three challenges combine together to make anti-Semitism online a particularly difficult thing to study. Hang on, there we go. So one of the ways in which anti-Semitism online has kind of traditionally been understood, or traditionally studied, I mean, traditionally is a bit of a silly way of putting it, considering it's only been around for 20 years or so, social media, is you look for kind of direct or explicit anti-Semitism. So what I mean by that, direct or explicit anti-Semitism, is anti-Semitism that comes in the form of kind of slurs or direct insults or threats or death wishes, that kind of thing. And often it uses keywords. So someone who wants to study this might go on Twitter and search for the word Jewish or Jew or Zionist or something like that, and then kind of analyze how many of those comments are anti-Semitic. And in these kind of explicit expressions, there's a direct relationship between the anti-Semitic concept that's being expressed and the language that's being used to express it. So if someone says, I don't know, I hate Jews or something like that, it's very obvious there's a clear kind of one-to-one relationship between what's being expressed and the way it's being, the concept that's being expressed and the manner in which it's being articulated. But I would say, after studying this stuff for quite a few years now, that actually the majority of anti-Semitism that's online on social media is not expressed directly or explicitly. It's expressed in implicit form or coded or disguised form. And that presents a much greater challenge to recognize, because the way that the linguistic forms through which these ideas are expressed are continually changing. There's a lot of puns and wordplay and in-jokes that you can only really understand the meaning of them if you understand the context in which they're being expressed. And so the problem is, if you take an approach where you're just, searching for certain keywords and searching for anti-Semitic comments that are expressed directly, you miss a huge amount of online anti-Semitism. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen this online, where some of the most viciously anti-Semitic comments that are posted on social media may not use the terms Jew, Jewish, Zionist, Israel at all. And that really presents a challenge, especially when you're talking about kind of automated recognition of anti-Semitic statements. So just as a few examples of some of the kind of indirect ways in which anti-Semitism can be expressed, we have at the top, there's like puns, like wordplay, where people kind of subtly change the word that you're using. So Soros, spelt with snake emojis, Holocaust, Schindler's List. All of these are real examples that we've taken from our data. Zion Nazis, of course, and then if you look at the last ones, there's 5 different ways in which the spelling of Israel has been changed, each of which communicating a different anti-Semitic concept. So ISS Real is a reference to Nazis, makes an analogy between Israel and the SS and the Nazi regime. Israel expresses this idea of Israel as this kind of innately or uniquely evil force in the world. Israel with a $sign expresses the idea of Israel or Jews as being associated with greed or money in some way. Isn't real expresses the idea that Israel either doesn't have the right to exist, or, as we often see, that Israel doesn't exist at all, that it's not a country, it's not, that there is no Israel, is one way in which people often express that. And the US real is the kind of idea that, you know, either Israel is in the pocket of the US, which may or may not be anti-Semitic, but it could also be the idea that the US is in the pocket of Israel, which definitely is anti-Semitic. So these very subtle changes shift the concept that's been expressed through them, and you can only pick that up through kind of qualitative analysis. Alongside that, you get allusions, where you kind of say one thing and kind of mean another. And again, you need context to understand them. So the example there that says someone should give Soros a shower, you know, if you read that with no world knowledge or contextual knowledge, you would think that was an innocuous statement. But of course, what it's a reference to is the gas chambers and the Nazi regime. The Austrian artist was right. Again, we know what is meant by that, but there are some contexts in which that statement would be perfectly acceptable. So again, the context is crucial to understanding this. Then you get things like indirect speech acts, where it might be like a rhetorical question: who owns the British media? Again, that could be an innocent question in some contexts, but in others, say it's posted again in response to an article about Israel or something, it definitely isn't, and it's expressing an anti-Semitic concept. And then you get lots of semiotic markers, like the three brackets around a Jewish person's name. And that's another interesting one, because initially that was a far right meme or idea, that you'd put 3 brackets around a Jewish person's name, or you'd put 3 brackets to represent the idea of Jews. But then that got adopted by people who were seeking to counter anti-Semitism. And so it's no good just finding 3 brackets and then saying that's anti-Semitic, because that clearly isn't the case anymore. So again, you need qualitative analysis of the actual context of the comment to understand the meaning that's being expressed. And then we've got memes, of course, images, and this is quite a good example to show how ideas are adapted and changed continually over time online. So the original meme was this idea, this kind of character called the Happy Merchant, which I think originated in a far right forum, and it expresses the idea of Jewish greed and a desire for money and wealth and all that kind of thing. But you can see how it's adapted to various different news events that crop up. So the one on the left is related to the COVID pandemic. The one in the middle is adapted to refer to Ukraine and the Ukraine war and Zelensky. And the one on the right is I think this is a far right meme, where it's, you know, a reference to the fall from the Garden of Eden and the snake and the apple, and it's a kind of an in joke. You know, it says only people of culture can see it. But so you need to be really keep up to date to see how these things are continually being adapted. And then there's more of these kind of Israel-related memes that I'm sure we're all very familiar with, all kind of playing with text and imagery to create meanings that you can't get from either the text or the image on its own in some cases, or you need to kind of understand the context in which it's being expressed and how these ideas are adapted and shift over time. So that's the scale of the challenge. And so the Decoding Antisemitism project, as the kind of name suggests, was about trying to literally kind of decode these implicit forms of anti-Semitism. And there are scholars, I think it's about 10 scholars from across Europe, working from different different backgrounds, working in different disciplines: humanities, social sciences, linguistics, data science, and we look at mainstream discourse in the UK, in France, and Germany. So it's important to emphasize that we're not looking at, radical spaces. We're not looking at places online where the radical right are, or the radical left, or anything like that, or Islamists or something. We're looking at mainstream spaces. And so the way the project works is, on a day-to-day level, the members of the team kind of scan the news horizon for news stories that we suspect might trigger anti-Semitic responses. So over the course of the project, we've done all sorts of things. Obviously, there's Israel-related stuff whenever Israel is involved in a conflict or whatever, but there's things like COVID, or there were trials of former concentration camp personnel in Germany, or I don't know, Jeremy Corbyn, or anything like that. So if we see something that's been reported in the news and we think this has the potential to provoke or stimulate anti-Semitic response, we keep a note of it, and we then try and download the comments that are posted online, usually in response to news articles that are published by mainstream newspapers or media outlets that are published on their social media profiles. So we'd look at, I don't know, BBC News Facebook profile, find a related story, and we download the comments from there, or the Guardian, or the Times, or the Telegraph, or Sky News. And the platforms we mainly look at are Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. We used to do a lot of work on Twitter, but unfortunately, since Elon Musk took over Twitter, he has made it extremely difficult to get access to the data, which is a real shame, because there's a huge, I'm sure you all know, there's a huge amount going on Twitter, but it's very difficult to access the data now. So we concentrate on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram at the moment. Once we've downloaded relevant comments, we then analyze them at two levels. We analyze them at the conceptual level, trying to see what is the concept that's being expressed, the anti-Semitic concept that's being expressed through the comment. So we look for what anti-Jewish stereotypes might be expressed, what kind of analogies are being made, I don't know, to the Nazis or to apartheid South Africa or something like that, and how the web user is positioning themselves within the discourse. Are they using their comment to make a threat, to attack another user, or something like that? So that's the conceptual level. Then we also look at the verbal, visual, and multimodal level, which is primarily what is the linguistic means by which that concept is being expressed. So the stuff we were looking at a few slides ago, puns, allusions, speech acts, rhetorical questions, memes, metaphors, that kind of thing. So it's conceptual and verbal. And so far over the course of the project, we've analysed, I think, more now of more than 125,000 online comments. In order to analyse them, we've developed an extremely sophisticated, we call it a guidebook. It's more of like a classification system, where we've listed, I think it has around 175 categories now, each of them kind of connected to a different anti-Semitic concept, stereotype, analogy, or linguistic mode of expression. So, and we use this program called MaxQDA, which you can see here. So on the left-hand side of the screen, so this is what we do in our daily work. The left-hand side of the screen, the bottom left, you can see there's a list of some of the categories that we use to classify the comments. On the right, that is the a thread. I think it's a BBC thread. I think this was about George Soros. And then what we do is we look at each comment, and then the colourful little labels. That's how we kind of annotate the comments. So we'll select, if we see something, we select it and we analyze it, and we say, okay, this is expressing the idea of Jewish power or something. And then we label it, whether it's direct anti-Semitism or contextual anti-Semitism, and try and build up a pattern, a model from that. And we've turned that kind of classification system. We're going to publish it as a book. which has each of the categories set out with little conceptual and historical section explaining the kind of history of the anti-Semitic concept or stereotype, and then giving real life examples, both explicit examples and implicit examples from our data set of how it's expressed online. And we also give some examples that come close to anti-Semitism, but which we don't think are anti-Semitism, because I think that's important. You've got to bear in mind that there are some concepts where there are grey areas, and you need to be able to make distinctions between anti-Semitic and non-anti-Semitic speech. Also on our website, we have a data visualization app where you can have a look at some of our results and play around and see which concepts are most prevalent and which ones come up the most related, depending on what the event is that we're looking at. Okay, so that's the challenge and the way that the project tries to deal with it. And I'll just quickly go through some of the results that from our recent work, which were looking at the responses to October the 7th and the subsequent war between Israel and Hamas. So when October the 7th happened, we immediately kind of set everything aside and just concentrated on that. And then we published a preliminary report, I think a month later, after October the 7th, after we analysed some 11,000 comments from YouTube and Facebook in the UK, France and Germany. And what was striking is that some of the threads had unprecedented levels of anti-Semitic expression. There were some of the threads in the UK and France, UK YouTube in particular, were hitting over 50% anti-Semitism in there. And what was interesting was the way there was a shift in the kind of means of expression of that anti-Semitism, even in comparison to other Israel-related discourse events. And then we built on those results in our discourse report, which was published last month, which is available on our website. We analysed another 10,000 or so, or 13,000 extra comments on Facebook and Instagram. And then we tried to contrast those results with the nearest similar event to October the 7th, which was the May 2021 escalation phase of the Middle East conflict, to see if October the 7th really was different. Our kind of conclusion, or, you know, we're still working on this, but what we think we could see the difference was that normally when you have an Israel-related discourse event, the dominant form of anti-Semitic expression online is a kind of demonization of Israel or of Israelis or of Jews, ideas of Israel being evil or wanting to kill children and all that kind of stuff. And those concepts still existed, but in the immediate aftermath of October the 7th, the dominant concept, the dominant form of expression was what we call forms of self-positioning, where the web user themselves kind of communicates their own feelings and thoughts, and that they're at the front of their expression. And the dominant form of self-positioning and expression that was articulated following October the 7th in the anti-Semitic comments was the affirmation of the violence, a celebration of the violence, which was very different, as we'll see in a minute, from previous Israel-related events. So here's just some examples that we've taken from our data. You know, they deserve 60 years of this, not only a day. Way to go, Hamas, we support you. Peaceful community must treat like this everywhere, which is, you know, obviously a threat to Jews everywhere. It's not just talking about Israel. And then you have affirmation of anti-Semitism and using some kind of, you know, Nazi kind of imagery and language. Jern the booze, which is an interesting one in terms of the way it's expressed implicitly. You know, at the moment, automated recognition wouldn't pick that kind of thing up. Palestinians will complete the job that the Austrian pater started. And then we had lots and lots of memes. This kind of paraglider image was posted all over the place. Famously, there was a Black Lives Matter branch that posted it, but there was all sorts of memes and lots of like creative usage of that imagery to signify celebration and affirmation of the violence. And so to show how different that was from previous times when Israel's been at war, where you do see a spike in anti-Semitism, but October the 7th, the immediate response was still different from that. we compared it with May 2021, which was, if you remember, there was a legal dispute about the Sheikh Jarrah area of Jerusalem. There were protests at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. There was then Hamas rocket fire. There were some communal tensions within Israel, and there were protests and attacks on Jews in around the world. At that point, we analysed around just 4,500 comments. And we were getting levels of around, in the UK, 26, 27% anti-Semitism, which is around what we normally find when we're analysing Israel-related events. And the biggest concepts that were expressed, the most frequent concepts, with this idea of Israeli evil, Israel as the sole guilty party for either this event or the entirety of the Middle East conflict, Israeli Jewish power over the media, which was particularly prominent when Hamas rockets were the focus. As soon as the media reported that, the idea was that Israel or Jews controlled the media, and there was lots of apartheid and Nazi analogies. But what there wasn't, as you can see on this graph here, if you look at the bottom, the very bottom category, which is pro-violence, affirmation of violence, there was very, very little direct affirmation of the violence. Whereas in 2023, on the right, you can see this huge jump. It was the biggest concept by far. So that's a big shift between 2021 and 2023. Some reasons for that. Well, we've got some hypotheses that we need to kind of flesh out properly. I think at the moment, one theory is that, in 2021, the Hamas rockets were not particularly successful. They were a threat or whatever, but they didn't cause that much damage or suffering. Whereas, so the response was more kind of conspiratorial. Israel is controlling the media, this kind of stuff, rather than celebratory. Now, perhaps if the rockets in 2021 had been more successful in their terms, then we might have seen a celebratory response. 7th of October perhaps was kind of understood as the first step towards Israel's eventual destruction, and led to this kind of outburst because of the success. Another thesis that we're working on is that we noticed in some of the threads, if the initial report was reporting directly on the events of October the 7th, say it was a report on the rave or something, and it was going into some quite graphic detail about what actually happened, there was a jump in both the percentage of anti-Semitic comments within the thread and the percentage of affirmatory or celebratory comments within the anti-Semitic comments. So there's something, I think, about the depiction of Jewish people or Israelis as vulnerable in some way seems to generate a higher anti-Semitic response and a celebratory response than other depictions. Another possible hypothesis for the difference is that in the time period between 2021 and 2023, there might have been an increase in the social acceptability of anti-Semitism, because during that period, there was the new Israeli government, which featured, some quite controversial figures. You had the Jewish judicial reform dispute within Israel. There were kind of outbursts of violence, sporadic outbursts of violence on the West Bank. But you also had these kind of big celebrity figures like Kanye West and Elon Musk, basically pushing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories on Twitter and getting a huge kind of hearing for that kind of mode of thought. And so perhaps all of those things accumulated to kind of prime the ground for the response that we saw immediately after October the 7th. We then carried on with the study, looking at tracking the response after the immediate response to October the 7th. So because it's important to remember that the comments I was just showing you, they were published before Israel had done anything. So Israel hadn't responded militarily at all at that point. So it wasn't a response to, the attacks on Gaza or anything like that. So we then carried on tracking it when the Israeli military response had got going. And the stories we were looking at ranged from, accounts of the military action to, Rishi Sunak visited Israel and stuff. The overall level of anti-Semitic comments remained around the same. a little bit less maybe, but there was a big drop in the affirmation of violence as the focus of the news stories shifted. And so it kind of reverted, the responses reverted back to what we would normally expect from an Israel-related story. So ideas of inherent Israeli evil, Israel as a terrorist state, the idea of genocide became very prominent, because of the whole ICJ cases, and it became a big concept in that way. But the pattern did kind of revert to what we normally expect. And then briefly, we noticed that Instagram was becoming a particularly important terrain for people discussing what was going on in Israel, particularly amongst younger people. So we did a study of 3,000 comments from 30 threads on Instagram, kind of covering a big range of people on there, from pro-Palestine accounts to pro-Israel accounts, and some people in the middle, as well as mainstream media. Again, we saw huge numbers of concepts of genocide, denial of Israel's right to exist, idea of Israel as evil, a lot of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories on Instagram, particularly around Jewish power and Jewish ownership of the media and of Instagram itself, in fact, and a lot of denial of anti-Semitism, which is the way that we categorize comments which deny that October the 7th happened, denied that Hamas killed civilians, or just in general kind of minimize the event of October the 7th. There was a lot of that going on. What was interesting on Instagram is that you could really see the influence that influencers have on their thread. So if the initial post was framed around a concept of, I don't know, Jewish power or influence, or a Nazi analogy or apartheid analogy, the comments in the thread really kind of replicated that. So you can really clearly see the power that some of these social media influencers have on the discussions that are based around their posts. And just one quick example, this is from I think it's the official State of Israel Instagram account, which was about the hostages, calling for the hostages to be returned home, of which 33% of the comments in response were anti-Semitic, and many of them kind of played with this idea of home that was in the initial post. You don't have home, the land you stole, so denying Israel's right to exist. And then this one, pack your stuff, you're going to be gypsy for the third time in your life. No one loves you in this world, which is clearly, there's no way you could depict that as a kind of, it's just about Zionism, it's just about Israel, it's not about Jews. That's clearly a reference to Jewish history and is an anti-Semitic comment. But if you look, you need to have the context to understand why those comments are anti-Semitic. You could not pick that up just from searching trigger words. Neither of them have the word Jew or Israel in them, and yet they are extremely anti-Semitic, especially the second one. And then the last two is a kind of examples of the way that Jewish power or conspiracy theories are kind of expressed on Instagram. The head of Insta is Israeli. They control everything. The satellites high up in the orbit and everything else. And again, certainly that second one, you wouldn't be able to pick that up just from, you need the context to understand why that's anti-Semitic. Okay, I'll leave it there. And yeah, I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Matthew, thank you for that fascinating presentation, which covered a lot of ground in a short time. You alluded to the difficulty at the beginning of determining whether certain content is or is not anti-Semitic, describing this as something of a chameleon concept. In your research, is there a set definition of anti-Semitism which you use? Noting, for example, that there have been some controversies as to how this ought to be defined. I'm thinking in particular of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, which gives an illustrative example of denying Jewish people their right to self-determination, such as by claiming the existence of the State of Israel is a racist endeavor, whereas other groups, albeit less popularly, have suggested that any criticism of Israel, however made, is permissible, is not anti-Semitic. So I'd be very interested to hear about how you navigate these definitional issues.
Yeah, I mean that's a huge issue. So our classification um, structure is initially based on the IRA definition, but we soon realized that actually, in order to, we use the term operationalize the IRA definition to actually use it in practical work of this sort, it needed to be greatly expanded and given far greater nuance because the IRA definition is working at a certain level of abstraction necessarily because it's a definition, whereas actually when you're encountering anti-Semitism in the wild, as it were, there's a huge range of ways of which it can be expressed, and so we had to build on IRA and kind of develop more categories in order to try and capture the variety of what we were seeing online. And in terms of the IRA and the JDA debates and all of that kind of stuff, I mean, obviously this is a huge, and it's a difficult issue. It's a difficult issue. Certain concepts, there's a huge amount of discussion and debate about it within the academic community. The concept of apartheid and stuff, and genocide more recently, right? Because there are different ways of approaching it. We definitely lean more to the IRA side. I would say, however, that actually, for all the controversy and the arguments, there is actually a lot of overlap between IRA and JDA. There are some core concepts and ideas of which there's a dispute, and apartheid would be one, BDS would be another one. But actually, even the Jerusalem Declaration clearly says that when you have traditional anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish concepts that are applied to Israel, so the idea of, I don't know, Israel being evil, Israel being, the cancer of the world, or responsible for all ills in the world, that kind of thing. JDA would also regard that as anti-Semitic. There are a couple of concepts which are clearly controversial, and we would lean more to the IRA side on those. But there's also a huge amount of overlap, I think, between them and between the nexus definition as well.
Related to that question on definitions, someone in the audience has asked if you can give some examples of grey areas in online anti-Semitism.
So I don't know. The idea of boycotts would be a good one. We think that if someone's talking about boycotting the whole of Israel, not the settlements or not the West Bank, but calling for a total boycott of Israel, we would class that as anti-Semitic. If someone was kind of reducing it and kind of limiting it and saying the settlements, we would have to think a lot harder about that. And because that isn't kind of denying Israel's legitimacy as a state, it's talking about a specific issue. So I think that would be one grey area. I mean, the concept of genocide, I think if you look at the history of the concept of genocide and the way it's been used as an accusation against Israel historically, there clearly is an anti-Semitic history to the way that is used. And a lot of it is, that people like accusing Israel of genocide because they get to say, oh, finally we can say it, the Jews have done what was happened to them, it enables them to make a Nazi analogy. But if someone, for example, is discussing the ICJ case and is using the concept of genocide in a very careful terms about, a discussion about what is happening right now, and it isn't kind of extended across the whole of Israeli history, and you would have to look at it and think, okay, well, are they using this in a different sense to that other way of doing it? I'm trying to think. I mean, like anti-elitism, for example, or George Soros. If someone's talking about George Soros, there are clearly ways in which you can talk about George Soros's financial activity or his career or whatever in anti-Semitic ways. But there are also ways in which you can do very harsh criticism of George Soros. I don't know, about the run on the pound in the early 90s or something, and you can express harsh criticism of him without being anti-Semitic. So you'd have to be really careful about drawing the line between those two things.
We've had a lot of questions from the audience about the sources of online anti-Semitism. And can I put this to you in two ways? are you able to distinguish between situations where it is individuals, genuine existing individuals, who are posting these comments or memes or content versus bots and automated content, which may perhaps be generated en masse by a bad actor such as a state? And secondly, where it is individuals, do you know anything about the profile of these individuals? Are they from the far left, the far right, Islamist groups, something else? Is there any information that you're able to derive as to the demographics and other affiliations?
Well, just to tackle the second question first, the way we work, we don't look at the identity of the people who are posting the comments. First of all, because it's quite difficult to corroborate that, you don't know who the people are online. Anyone can say anyone is. And so to do the work that you'd need to really, identify an individual and be sure it's that individual would be a different task from the one we're trying to do. We're trying to look at how it kind of objectively, anti-Semitism objectively expresses itself online, rather than necessarily look at the identity of the individual who's doing it. And I think other people are doing it, and it's a very important task, but it's also very difficult just because of the challenges of the way that the internet works. But it's maybe something we should look into in the future in some way, I think. In terms of bots or automated things or state actors, I think it definitely exists. I think it varies from platform to platform. I think Twitter would be a prime place where that kind of thing would exist. Unfortunately, we can't access the Twitter data at the moment. I mean, even on Facebook or YouTube, sometimes you can see the same comment that's been repeated again and again and again in a very, fixed way, and that does indicate a problem. But in general, I think it's real people. I think it's real people replying, and in some ways, it would be nice to think that this stuff was coming from state actors, because then you could say, okay, well, this is coming from, it's a top-down process. Unfortunately, I think a lot of this is a bottom-up process, and I think most of the discussion is coming from real people.
In terms of the legal consequences of anti-Semitic posts, and I don't know to what extent this is something which your expertise covers, but we have had quite a lot of questions, and I appreciate the answers will differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But one person has asked whether the chameleon-like nature of Jew hatred, as they describe it, which allows people, in their words, celebrities like Gary Lineker and Charlotte Church are identified by this person as making what they describe as subtly anti-Semitic comments. And then for those individuals to claim those are in no way anti-Semitic. The question asks, how can the law keep up with the ever-adapting nature of the problem? So are existing laws, in your view, sufficient? And if not, what sort of mechanisms could be used to improve things?
I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know. I don't have enough knowledge to know about the legal potential legal solutions to it. I mean, I do think one problem is, especially on social media, that a lot of these companies are privately owned, and there is regulation, public regulation, that is being developed, I think, especially in the EU, to try and tackle some of this stuff. But I think Twitter's a good example here, that everything at the moment seems to rest on the will of Musk, whether he, how he wants to manage kind of detection of hate speech on his platform, and if social media is becoming the primary site of public discourse, then I just don't think it's reasonable for one man to have that much control over the way in which it's regulated. But yeah, the broader question about the law and how hate speech should be regulated is kind of a bit above my pay grade, I think.
We've had lots of questions about, leaving aside the law, how individuals might go about responding to anti-Semitism that they see online, on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, places where it might be possible to, for example, post comments in response to anti-Semitic content. In your view, to what extent are such comments effective? Do the algorithms promote them? Is there a significant degree of engagement with comments after they have been made, perhaps seeking to dispel false narratives and tropes, and to call things out as anti-Semitic? Or, as some other people in the audience have suggested, is this simply providing oxygen to the fire of anti-Semitism and having a counterproductive effect?
Yes, this is an extremely pressing and difficult issue. I mean, I think some research has shown that actually engaging in what we would call counter speech can be counterproductive, because for some of these people, what they want is a response, and if you give them a response, they get a kick out of it essentially, and it kind of keeps them going, and they want to do it again and again and again and up the stakes. So I think sometimes counter speech can not be that helpful. I wonder if it changes depending on who the speaker is. You know, if it's just a random Twitter account, a random Instagram account, I'm not sure it's that helpful. If it is a celebrity who's pushing things, then I think perhaps it is important that they're challenged. I mean, there are some organizations that are kind of called like trusted reporters, I think, where you can report, you know, if there are repeat offenders, you could forward their details to, I mean, in the UK, you've got people like the CST. There's an organization in Germany called Hate Aid, which people can forward, you know, problematic accounts to or whatever, and then they can kind of compile them and trying to think about what to do with them. So I think in some circumstances, counter speech is important. You know, it depends on the platform. It depends on the nature of the discussion. You know, if you're talking about Israel and Palestine and someone is coming out with complete, you know, historical untruths or whatever, sometimes it can be helpful if someone can post a different historical narrative or whatever. But in general, I wouldn't put too much faith in the effectiveness of getting embroiled in long arguments with some of these people, because I think that's what they want ultimately.
We've had two quite similar questions on this difficult boundary relating to criticism of the Israeli government or its policies versus criticism of Israel, and indeed perhaps criticism of Jewish people more generally. One person asks is whether calling for condemnation of Israel for alleged collective punishment on citizens of Gaza, whether that is anti-Semitic in your definition. And another person asks somewhat relatedly, would you agree that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but criticism of Israeli government policy in any area falls under the boundaries of legitimate political speech?
Okay. The collective punishment one, that's, you know, we haven't had that many. If I'm thinking of all the ones we've analysed over the last few months, we haven't had that many using that kind of precise terminology. I know they're out there. I'm just thinking of the ones we've been looking at. I think we would have to see the context of it. A lot of the time, what we're looking for when we're making the distinction between, you know, legitimate criticism of the Israeli government, which, you know, can be criticized like any other government on earth, and anti-Semitic kind of, you know, non-critique of Israel, if you like, is a pattern of kind of generalization and essentialization. So if the claim is that, you know, the activity that they're condemning is not just, you know, something to do with this minister or this government or, you know, military operations in general, but somehow represents a kind of essential core of Israelness that exists over time, you know, regardless of time and space. So Israel is essentially evil, or kind of essentially bloodthirsty, or something along those lines. If the concept that's been expressed is making it this core, unchangeable characteristic of Israel as such, that's a very big red flag for us that it's an anti-Semitic comment. So that's one way. And then another one is a generalization, which is that you might take one incident and then you kind of extend that and make that kind of characteristic of all Israelis, the whole of Israeli society, the whole of Israel's history, or whatever. So essentialization and generalization are the two. In terms of collective punishment, I think I could see a way in which that could be framed, it could be expressed in an anti-Semitic way, for sure. I also think there's a way in which it could be expressed in a more ambiguous way that might not automatically merit being labeled as anti-Semitic. And the second one was, do I think anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism? That's a very difficult question, because it depends what you mean by anti-Zionism. It depends what you mean by Zionism. I do think there is a history of non-anti-Semitic anti-Zionism that existed prior to the state of Israel. I think it's slightly dubious when anti-Zionists today claim that they're somehow making the same arguments as kind of anti-Zionist Jews might have done in, the early 25th century or whatever. But I do think it probably is hypothetically possible to be anti-Zionist and not anti-Semitic in some way. I think it's quite difficult, though. So I wouldn't say the two are exactly the same. I do think there's a potential, there is an overlap for sure, but I don't think it's identical. Yes, and I think I covered the rest of it in the first answer. Yeah, thanks.
Returning to the question of the identity or background of the speakers, and you mentioned that this isn't something that your research covers for various reasons. Someone has put that question in a slightly different way, which perhaps does go to the core of your research, which is in terms of the context in which a certain word or phrase or idea is expressed. And the questioner gives an example of a situation where a Jewish person says something about other Jewish people, or perhaps about Israel. And in the context of them perhaps joking with another Jewish friend, some people might not consider that to be anti-Semitic. But if a non-Jewish person had said it with malicious intent, then it might be considered anti-Semitic. So to what extent is your research able to identify and analyze those quite subtle differences of context in terms of delineating whether something is or is not anti-Semitic?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So our approach is all we have to go on is what's in the comment, right? So the text that's in the comment, the kind of linguistic structure of the comment, and what the comment is responding to, both in terms of other comments and the news article. So we wouldn't be able to, know whether it was a Jewish person talking to another Jewish person. Now, they may say in the comment that they're a Jewish person and they're speaking from that position, and we would take that into account. But I have to say, most of the comments I see where that kind of "I'm Jewish and I think this" online, they tend to be "I'm Jewish and I think Israel is the cancer of the world" or something. That's often the way in which it's used to legitimize quite extreme anti-Israel rhetoric. And then in that circumstance, for example, we're looking at the anti-Semitic concept that's being expressed, not the identity of the speaker, because ultimately the identity of the speaker doesn't really matter. If you're expressing an anti-Semitic concept, is an anti-Semitic concept online, because we can't see that one-to-one personal relationship, we're just looking at what's written. That's all we have to go on. And I don't think I mentioned this in the talk, but I think I should mention it now. I've seen some people, I was saying about, again, counter speech might not be that useful. The ultimate aim of the project which I really should have brought up earlier, is hopefully to try and build a kind of artificial intelligence, machine learning program or algorithm that's able to pick up on implicit anti-Semitism, not just explicit, but implicit anti-Semitism. So the machine will make the same decisions as I would if I was classifying the comment. And hopefully, if we're able to do that, and it is progressing pretty well, then we'll be able to pick up automatically a much greater range of anti-Semitic comment. So yeah.
Your comment on the output of your project brings us, I think, quite nicely to the final topic that I'd like to cover, which again, quite a lot of people have asked about in the Q&A, which is potential solutions to the problem of anti-Semitism. So you've mentioned the training of an algorithm that your project is contributing to. What have you seen from the online platforms in terms of their response to anti-Semitism? Has it changed? Has it adapted in the 4 years or so, I think it is, since that your project was initiated, but also in the past 5 months since October the 7th?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Again, I think it varies from platform to platform. I think Twitter is an outlier here. Twitter has definitely, it's gone downhill over the last couple of years in terms of its not just willingness to tackle this stuff, but even interest in tackling it. So I think Twitter is has a big problem. Facebook, I think they are concerned, and they've been increasingly concerned, over the last few months as well. And we've had people from Facebook get in touch to talk to us about how to deal with comments that talk about Zionist and Zionism, and how to recognize when a comment that uses that kind of terminology is anti-Semitic and when it's not, because obviously they're dealing with a huge amount of stuff. And because Meta, they own Instagram as well, so that's there. So I do think there is concern, but I think I think they're all a bit stuck about how to deal with it because it's so complex, and because you have this implicit explicit thing. Either you need to employ a huge number of people who are kind of experts and able to recognizing it, or you're waiting for some kind of automated version that is able to pick it up. And in general, I do think that actually over the next probably 5 years or something, you will get artificial intelligence that's much better at picking this stuff up. So I do think the situation online might get worse before it gets better, but I do think it will get better eventually. Whether that solves the problem, I don't think it will solve the problem, because the internet, I think, intensifies and accentuates certain social dynamics, but I'm not sure it creates them. So I think the problem lies at a deeper level of the internet. It lies at a kind of more societal level. And so I guess you'd have to look at, universities engaging in different, you need to engage in lots of different fields rather than relying on a kind of technological fix, I think.
I think we're just coming up to the end of time. So very quickly, Matthew, as a final question, you've already mentioned to some degree what the output of your project is going to be, but could you very briefly just talk about how your work and that of other researchers might be fed into what the technology companies are trying to do, and perhaps what your hopes are as to the overall outcome of the project?
Well, I definitely think so. The book we're bringing out, which is this guide to identifying online anti-Semitism, I think that would be very useful for comment moderators of all platforms to read and use as a kind of reference guide. That's why we've written it, really. So, there's a practical reference guide to try and, so if you have human moderators, they can actually use some of this stuff to try and improve the ways in which they recognize anti-Semitic material online. The longer term goal would be it's going to have to be some kind of automated system, because the problem is you're now getting images and text generated by AI, which is that's a growing problem. images. You've had lots of images of AI generated images of things that Israel has supposedly done or whatever. And that thing is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So you're actually in a situation where you need AI in order to counter the AI generated anti-Semitism. It's basically two AIs kind of facing off against one another, which is slightly sci-fi and ridiculous, but that's kind of where it's going. So on the one hand, I think we can train human moderators better, and we hope some of our work will feed into that. And on the other hand, is the technological solutions that hopefully we can kind of keep developing. I'm going to post the website of the project in the chat because I've just seen that people have been asking me to do that. There we go. Oh no, I think I've sent that to the wrong everyone. Here we go. There we are.
Thank you very much indeed, Matthew, for an incredibly enlightening discussion on what is undoubtedly an extremely challenging problem. Please do visit the UK LFI Charitable Trust YouTube channel, which features past websites, webinars, as well as many examples of UK LFI members providing information on Israel and anti-Semitism to the world's media, as well as, of course, visiting the website that Matthew has kindly posted. You can get the latest updates from UK LFI about its work by following it on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you again, Matthew, and thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you very much for having me.